Starting off with our homepage, you can click the Scout icon in the top left-hand corner to see a list of all of your applications running in Scout APM with a couple of metrics for both your web endpoints, your background jobs, as well as the total time consumed and when it last reported. As you can see with the web endpoints, you both get a snapshot of the response time and the throughput, as well as for your background jobs, you get a snapshot of your execution time and the throughput. If we jump into our application here, this is our overview page. The overview page will show you a brief overview of all of your performance metrics, time frame, and our insights tab. So as you can see up here in the top right-hand corner, you can change the time frame as high as 7 days, as low as 30 minutes. You can also play around with ending earlier in the month for any of these time frames, as well as comparing it to different periods. You can compare it to your previous period, yesterday, last week, and last month. So for example, if we want to look at the last 3 days versus last week, and we click on this, we get some really awesome comparatives to what's happening in our application now versus last week to see what might be going on differently and what we can either change or fix within our application. As you can see, as I'm moving my cursor, you can see the throughput line moving for both now versus the previous. And over here, it's pretty steady. But as you can see with that spike, we can maybe dive in a little bit deeper a little bit later to see why this might be happening. If I remove this comparison, we go back to our regular interactive dashboard. And with our interactive dashboard, you can highlight a particular time period on the graph itself and pull out web endpoints that saw higher response times. Let's look at this big spike right here. And I'm just going to click and drag on that spike. And as you can see, the entire list of web endpoints with a really high response time will show up right here. Obviously, not every single one of these endpoints might be the culprit of this spike, but as you can see, as we go through this list here, that highlighted section stays on the graph for each of these, so we can see what might be happening. Let's click into one of these web endpoints to see what else we can do with this. Once we click into this endpoint, as you can see, the highlighted section carries through to that next page. All insights on both this performance overview breakdown, as well as the traces tab with information on transaction traces for this highlighted time period, will be for this highlighted time period only. However, if we remove this highlight here, all of the data will revert back to the time frame that we have set up here at the top right corner. Let's go back to the overview page. You can customize what you're seeing on this interactive dashboard by clicking through the different metrics buttons here. We have the response time, which is the page load time for your users, the 95th, which is a different way of describing the response time. It measures the slowest 5% of your web endpoints. The throughput, which is how many users are accessing your application over that time period set up here in the top right corner. Errors in memory are pretty self-explanatory. It, of course, shows your errors in memory usage respectively. And we also have your apdex. It is a number between 0 and 1, measuring your customer satisfaction here. The closer to 1 you have, the better. So as you can see here, if we just click on one of these boxes, that yellow line is going to change to reflect the metrics that we want to see. So as you can see, as I'm hovering over here, we can see our apdex. If we want to look at our 95th, we can see that here as well. And when that changes, for example, with this spike here, or even just the throughput, what we were looking at a little bit earlier. Next, we're going to dive into the N+1 Insights tab down here. This is where we can see various endpoints where we found an N+1 and the number of queries right here on the right, as well as how long those queries were taking. It's important to note with Scout that the time frame pulls insights over the past 24 hours. So once an N+1 is fixed, it may take some time to disappear from this list down here. It doesn't mean that it was not fixed. Let's click into one of these N+1 insights and take a little look at what we can see with Scout. When you click into one of these N+1 insights, you get this really helpful timeline view where you can see where an N+1 showed up, for example, after a deploy. As you can see here, from this endpoint, you get to see what endpoints are called in succession after this endpoint. And you can see with this little flag right here where an N+1 is happening. Now, it's really nice to have because you can click in this N+1 section on the SQL button. And this button shows you the exact SQL query of where this N+1 is happening. We do scrub data, so any type of data that will show up as a question mark, as you can see right here, instead of your actual data for privacy reasons. Currently, this timeline view is in a condensed view, and it just pulls relevant endpoints to the top for streamlined insights. However, if we unclick this condensed view, you get to see all of the web endpoints called. So you can dive down a little bit deeper to see, hey, maybe there's another N+1 here, or maybe something else is being called that I'm not thinking is supposed to be called. So you can dive down and see what issues are happening here. On this page, we also have a summary tab that gives you a top-down summary of the time spent by each call. This is really helpful too if you want just a quick overview of what's happening for each call and how long each call is taking. You still get that N+1 flag, so you can dive down into that timeline view to see what's happening as well. You also have a couple of metrics here on where the time is being taken up by this call. So the response time, as well as 97% in this case is being taken up by a SQL query, and 2% is being taken up by the controller, things like that. We also have up here on the top a context tab where you can set up custom context, which I will talk about a little bit later, to see a little bit more in-depth information about your application and what might be happening with this N+1. Going back to that overview page, another useful feature that our customers absolutely love is our Slow Queries Insights tab. This tab lists all of the various slow queries present in your application. Just as a note, these queries don't always have to be slow either, as something could be taking up a lot of time within an endpoint or a background job. Let's click into one of these endpoints. And once we click into here, we are taken into that endpoint and we can see the time it takes different traces within a single query. First of all, we have, again, the SQL query, so you can see exactly where this is happening. But below here, as you can see, we have a whole bunch of call buttons where you can see how long each trace has taken. So, there might be a difference between the 3 calls that took 654 milliseconds versus almost 2,000. So we can click into these calls to see really what's going on. And we get this really awesome timeline view. Just like the other timeline view that we were just looking at with the N+1s, you get to see everything that's happening with that SQL button again, just in case if you need a reminder of where this query is happening, as well as a backtrace button. And this backtrace button gives you the trace of where this call is happening with the path name, as well as the line number. So you can dive in to your IDE or wherever you store your code to actually see where this trace is happening. We do have a GitHub integration, as you can see down here with this enable button, that will essentially show you the exact line of code right here on Scout without having to dive in yourself. On this overview page, we also have an Errors Insights tab, and this is just a snapshot of what you will see on the errors page. It'll list all of the errors across all transactions for your set time period. It's really nice if you want to just jump into your app and see what's happening without having to dive into the errors tab. If, for example, you might not have a lot of time in your day. However, we do, again, have an entire errors page that you can really dive into each error specifically, and I will talk about that in a little bit. Now let's dive into these tabs up here at the top, starting with the Web Endpoints page. Before we start on the Web Endpoints page, I'm going to highlight that spike that we were looking at a little bit earlier. And let's pretend that we want to dive down into these web endpoints a little bit further. So this web endpoints page here gives you a list view of all of your web endpoints in your application. And it lists them in order of time consumed by the application. Time consumed is calculated by the response time times the throughput divided by all other endpoints in the application. So a high time consumed endpoint means that it's one of the most trafficked endpoints in your application, and therefore it's best to give attention to those endpoints to give the greatest impact to your users. As you can see here on this page, we do get some pretty awesome metrics like the time consumed, as I was just talking about, as well as the response time, throughput, max allocations, and the error rate. But the really cool thing about this is, remember how I highlighted just a minute ago on the overview page? You can actually see that highlighted section on the graph for each web endpoint if, for example, you find that spike, but you're not really sure which web endpoint is making that spike. You can dive into each web endpoint in your application and see on the graph what might be the culprit, which is really nice to be able to dive into. And of course, if you click on the name of this endpoint, we will be taken back to that timeline view that we were looking at just a little bit before. Now let's go to the background jobs tab. The background jobs tab shows the execution time and the throughput for the various background jobs in your application, and it provides similar insights as the Web Endpoints tab. Obviously, right now, we only have one background job running, but it still shows you all the information you're going to get anyways. You get the queue if you have anything else set up, as well as that execution time, throughput, latency, max allocations, and the error rate. Very similarly to that web endpoints page, you also get that really nice little blue highlight on the graph if you want to see what might be happening during that spike and if your background job might be a part of that error. Again, very similarly to that web endpoints page, if we click into this name, we get taken to a timeline view here, as well as that graph where you can see what's happening with that background job. That highlight has persisted through, just like we saw earlier, as well as having that performance overview breakdown in the traces tab to see what's really going on with just that specific background job. Now let's talk about the database tab. The database tab is one of Scout's differentiators from our competitors here. The database tab shows how your database performs in relation to your application. It lists queries based off of time consumed, which is similar to that web endpoints page, but essentially just throughput times the query time. And it provides insights on what a specific query is and where it occurred. Let me remove this highlighting real quick. And we can dive down into this tab or in this table right here. And as you can see, we have all of our traces here in list of time consumed, as you can see over here, as well as we also have some other metrics like the throughput, as well as the mean query time and the 95th query time over here on the right. When we look into one of these here, you can see the actual SQL query of what's happening, as well as those same call buttons that we were looking at before. So you can see all of the transaction traces in order to figure out what might be going a little bit longer than others and why it might be the highest time consumed. Just like we saw right at the beginning of this database tab, there is a highlighting feature here. And this highlighting tool filters values on your database tab to just what you've highlighted. So let's pick this section right here where there is a spike. And by highlighting this section of data you want to investigate, our platform will show the increase and decrease of the mean time of your highlighted time versus the rest of the timeline. As you can see down here, we have these little arrows on the throughput as well as the mean and the 95th of that increase or decrease. So for example, this is an 833% increase in throughput of just this highlighted time in relation to that rest of the timeline that we have set of the last 3 days in the top right-hand corner. The awesome part about our database tab, though, is once we have this highlighted section on the graph, we can go down here and see that there are a couple of values that are grayed out. And that is because that's not in relation to the timeline that we have set up here. So it's a lot easier to go in and maybe find a culprit or something that might be attributing to that spike in your database, which is really nice to be able to go in and check as well. One more thing to point out here is when it's highlighted, you can also see the ranking of the time consumed and how it's changing in the list for that highlighted section. As you can see, it's going up 1, 11, 6, things like that. Now, before we go into the traces page, I'm going to talk a little bit about custom context. So with the use of custom context, you can go further in understanding not only which developer wrote a certain piece of code, but also how and which customers a specific query impacted. So establishing custom context enables you to define different values to better understand why a particular query was slow here. So on the Traces tab, you can get an overview of your slowest web endpoint traces for your chosen time period, again, up here on the right. And you can see these endpoints here on this left-hand side. This tab will also show your custom context in boxes right here, and any other additional data will appear on this page outside of Scout's out-of-the-box content. So we can highlight and filter values to see if different users, for example, are having a slower experience more consistently than others. So if we highlight a section of response time here. As you can see, the endpoints are going to be reactive to that. So if we're looking for around 4,000 milliseconds of response time, you can see the endpoints that relate to it, as well as the custom context, as well as a list of transaction traces at the bottom of the page in relation to that response time. Now with these transaction traces, it's really nice. We have a lot of data here that you can see exactly when this happened, the endpoint, the URI, as well as how long this actual trace took. So you can go around and play around with that response time to see maybe this trace right here is taking a lot more time than it should. Another cool feature that we have on this traces page is being able to filter out data with our custom context boxes here. So right now we have a couple of custom context set up, for example, our transaction ID, our path, URI, and memory delta. So if, for example, we have a specific path that might be causing some really slow web endpoints, we can click just on this path, and as you can see, that entire graph of the response time changed to show exactly what the response time is, as well as, if we click on that path again, see how it's still highlighted? We still have the endpoint right here of where this is happening, as well as the transaction IDs, memory deltas, and URI for where this is happening as well. So it's really nice to be able to filter not just by endpoint or by response time, but also by these custom values that are specific to your application that will help you dive down more into what you want to see metrics-wise from your application. Next, let's jump into the errors tab. All right, this needs to be edited out because they don't have errors. Let me jump over to Scout's errors, and hopefully an easy transition into that can be made. The errors tab will show your errors by both type, as you can see on this graph right here, as well by endpoint. It, of course, will show you the various times your app experienced an error, and you can drill down further into all of these by clicking the Explore button right here. First of all, let's take a look at this graph right here. It's really nice that you're able to both see the amount of events this error has happened, or at least how long or how many times this error has happened, as well as the location, the request URI, and a spark line, so you can see exactly what's going on with this error. Now let's click into this one right here. And as you can see, we have the list of every time this error has occurred. So it's really interesting and really helpful to be able to go in and say, what's difference between the 31st of May and the 14th of June? Or maybe why they're the same and where this is happening. So we can click into this error right here, and we get the actual error that's happening right here, some request parameters, the URI if it has one, the location if it has one, as well as the request parameters here. You get the IP as well as any other custom context that you have set up. You have that backtrace again, and if you have the GitHub integration, you are able to see the exact line of code of where this error is happening for the entire stack trace, as well as any session data that might be happening, the server environment, and some more information on the left-hand side about this error, like the number of occurrences, when this specific error happened, and when the first occurrence of this error happened as well. You can also see any comments right here and add comments on this error too, if there are multiple people looking at this, to see what's happening and where you can dive down into this. The last thing that I want to show you here is the alerting tab. This is where you can set up alerts. Obviously, we don't have any right now, but you can set up alerts by looking at our documentation under the Features tab. We go here, go to our features. Over here on the right-hand side, you can go to alerting, and our documentation lists all of the metrics that you can set up for alerting, which is really nice for both your web requests and your background jobs. We also have documentation on how to set that up and what to do, as well as if we keep scrolling down here, we have a list of all of the alerting integrations for your alerts, like Slack, PagerDuty, OpsGenie, and things like that. If, for example, we click into Slack, we have an entire documentation page on how to integrate with Slack to make this really easy to add alerting. On top of alerting integrations, we also have a couple other integrations like error monitoring. So on top of our errors, you can actually add other error monitoring tools like Rollbar, Sentry, and Honeybadger if you also like to see those errors as well. And of course, on our documentation, like I talked about before, we do have instructions on how to set up the GitHub integration.